Hi, everyone. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Excellent. And thank you, everyone, for coming. I think we still have some people joining. As we wait for them to join, I'll just briefly introduce the program and our speaker as well. So my name is Theophilus Teddy Kojanyomi, and I'm really excited to have you all here. I am chair of InciSioN Ghana and a surgical registrar in general surgery in the UK here. I'll just give a brief background of how or how far the InciSioN Ghana Research Mentorship Program has come. So we started from March 2022, and so far we had about 44 mentees successfully matched to mentors who are at different stages of their research projects with their mentors. Now, for those who could not get onto qualified applicants who couldn't get matched with mentors, we grouped all those applicants into groups of 8 to undertake systematic review and meta-analysis according to areas of their interest. And so generally we have this distribution of the different groups. And they are also at different stages of the systematic review and meta-analysis process. So in terms of the webinars, this would be our 7th webinar. Our first one was with Professor Hesse and Dominic Verwood, and they spoke to us about the setting your research question and literature review and literature search. Our second webinar was with Mr. Alan Askari, who spoke about choosing your study design. The third one was an interesting one, looked at the ethics surrounding research given to us by Ms. Aisha Nurani and Dr. Anita Beko from Ghana. And then the fourth webinar was on how to write a research proposal and some of the mistakes people make when they write their research proposals. And that was delivered by Professor Anson and Ms. Alice Chai. And our fifth webinar was by Mr. Ali Navi, who spoke about data collection, the importance of collecting your data the right way the first time, and what to do if you made a mistake with your data collection process. Our sixth webinar was also with Mr. Alan Askari, who talked about data cleaning and data analysis. And before I introduce our speaker for today, I just want to acknowledge some of the people who have been very helpful to us. GIGS, InciSioN Global, and ASTE MRCS. Oh, yes. Finally, I would introduce, our speaker for today, and in the person of James Glasbey. James is an NIHR doctoral research fellow in global surgery at the University of Birmingham. He's been involved in collaborative work and worked in large national and international research collaborative groups to deliver prospective cohort studies and randomized control trials, some of which are very known to most of us in Ghana, like Falcon, for example. And he's worked with groups like Global Surge, Star Surge, etc. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic as well, he has been instrumental in the COVID Surge collaborative portfolio, which many of us would be familiar with, that has aimed to improve data driven decision making for patients undergoing surgery during the pandemic. It is my singular honor and pleasure to welcome James Glasbey today to our webinar. James, over to you. Thank you for coming.
Oh, thanks, Teddy. That's a very kind introduction, and honestly, I'm absolutely honored to be here. First of all, huge congratulations to InciSioN Ghana and setting up this program. I think it's really world leading, and it's amazing to see so many enthusiastic young students and young trainees interested in research with this mentorship from around the world. So big congratulations to Teddy and the team, and I feel really honored to be here today, and it's lovely to see quite a few familiar names on the chat. I think I've worked with quite a few of you before on different projects. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and hopefully we can have an interesting and engaging discussion this evening. So I'm going to keep my presentation relatively short, probably about 20 minutes or so, to give us plenty of time for questions. So if there's anything, I appreciate you're probably about 6 months into your dedicated research projects now, so you probably are starting to get some of you will be starting to get some data in. And so hopefully this is a very timely presentation about how to approach data interpretation. Okay, so my conflict of interest, my only conflict of interest is that I absolutely love research. I really love research. I've been liking research for about 10 years or so now. And I've worked with Teddy and many members of the Ghanaian team probably for most of that 10 years. This is a photo of us in Accra when we had a global surgery meeting there in 2018, I think it was. And it's been an absolute pleasure to work with the teams. I find that research is so fulfilling alongside clinical practice, and it's amazing to work with a community of people internationally that share the same passion for improving our patients' outcomes. And the fact that you're dining in on your free evening to do so probably means you share that same passion. So yeah, it's great to meet you all today. Okay, so I'm not planning to be comprehensive today, but I'm hoping to go through some of the steps that you need to take you from your data set to understanding some of the patterns in your data and trying to create a message, a story from your data. And I'll give you one real world example of a paper that I've spent quite a lot of time on over the last 6 months working on, and I'm delighted to say it's coming out in the Lancet at the end of the month. And I'll be focusing on observational research. So can anyone see my slides okay?
Yeah, we can see.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm just double checking. So I'll be focusing on observational research. I suspect that most of you in your mental projects are doing observational studies because they're a bit more accessible in terms of getting approvals more quickly in terms of regulation, funding, and that sort of business. So I'm focusing mainly on observational research today. There's some specific nuances to trials and other study designs, which I probably won't go into in detail. Although, as I said, I love research, so I'm very happy to talk about that separately, or if anyone wants to answer anything specifically in the questions. I'm not going to be able to address everything you need to know to completely understand everything to do with data interpretation, but hopefully some guiding principles which you can stick by when you're first approaching your analyses. And as I said, as much as we can make this a discussion, it probably makes it a lot more beneficial for everybody. So please do jump in if you have any specific questions. I'll have a few pauses throughout. If not, at the end, I'd love to have any specific questions about your project or any general questions about the concepts I bring up. So I'm going to use an example to try and take us through what we did for this paper. It's in preprint at the moment, and it's around a surgical preparedness index. So basically what we did is we looked with an international group around the world at what effectively can make hospitals less likely to cancel surgery. Now, cancellations of surgery are a total nightmare. I'm not sure what the situation like is in Ghana at the moment, but currently on the day of surgery cancellations are rife in the UK. The common reasons are a high-risk patient with no kind of high dependency service afterwards, or there's not enough beds in the hospital, or sometimes a particular piece of equipment is not available. And it's very frustrating for patients, it's frustrating for surgeons, because all we want to do is get on and operate and try and help our patients. So we wanted to go about with this international COVID surge community, trying to improve things. So we did a 3-step project. Number one, we went through a consensus process to find out what are the features of hospitals which mean that they're able to avoid, cancelling a planned operation on the day of surgery. And we created an index which people could use to rate their hospital across different domains. And then secondly, we kind of measured this around the world. So we measured it in 1,632 hospitals in 120 countries to get an idea of how strong or how weak different hospitals were around the world across all of these different domains. And finally, we wanted to get some ideas as to what that meant. So if we say a hospital is more prepared, do they have fewer cancellations? Are they able to continue surgery when there is pressure on the health system? And we've used kind of COVID-19 as an example that we all know about. But actually pressure on health systems can come from lots of different reasons. It can be weather pressures. So in the UK, we have a winter crisis every year, which means we can't operate very much for about a month over Christmas because there's too many people with respiratory diseases and elderly people that fall over and things like that. In different places, there might be airborne, non-airborne pandemics, natural disasters, waves of different endemic diseases, and all of these things contribute to strain on a surgical service. So we use this as an example, and I'll walk you through what I did to go from what was like quite a complex data set to understanding what the messages could have been. So step 0, that's before you start doing any data interpretation, you need to make sure that you've got some strong research questions. This is probably straying into some of the talk you've done before, but without hypothesis-driven research, you can't start your data interpretation. If you've just got a data set and you're going to start analyzing it without having structured research questions, you just end up doing data mining, and your risk of having a type 1 error and finding spurious findings in your data set is very high. So just before you start doing any data interpretation, make sure you go back to your research proposal and you have somewhere between 1 and maximum 3 research questions that you're going to frame your interpretation around. And so for this project, I asked with the team, what makes a hospital prepared for stresses on the health system? And question number 2 was, if we know what those features are, how prepared are surgical systems around the world? And then question number 3 was, is this preparedness, is that associated with the likelihood of elective cancellations, not being able to do the surgery that we promised our patients? So those are my 3 research questions. Anything else is a bit, it might be of interest, but it's a bit spurious. So when you're going to write a paper, you want a nice structured few research questions. Brilliant. So step 1 in your data interpretation, I think before you start doing any type of analysis, just absolutely go back to your case report form, your data collection form. That might have been on a tool like Excel, very accessible for everyone. Sometimes projects are run on things like RedCat, which is an electronic data capture system, which we use for lots of our collaborative research work. So before I start any data analysis, I always go back and look, what exactly did we collect and what levels did we? So for each data point, what could people put in and what options did we give people? And I have to say, however much you plan these studies and you do them over and over again, they're always going to have some little problems with your case report form at the end. And we'll talk about how to get around some of those during data interpretation. So step 1, absolutely know, like each data point, what did you collect? What were the options for people? And was there any interactions between the data points? Here's an example from this project. So this is the different questions we asked. We asked about all of these different features, 23 in total, about your hospital, and patient and people that were responding were able to give some more information about their hospital itself and them as an assessor. So really encourage you, beginning of the project, research questions and understand what data you've collected. Right, step 2, that's your data cleaning. This can be one of the most difficult and long-winded processes in big data sets. I suspect many of your projects will be single center, perhaps multi-center, which is fantastic. Hopefully, we won't have too many hundreds, thousands of patient entries, but effectively, the more data points you have and the more patients you have, the longer the data clean is going to take you. We did a project called Surgery, which I think many of you were involved in last year, which collected data on about 150,000 patients, and I think there was about 65 data points collected for each patient. So you're talking about millions of data points that need cleaning, curating, making sure they're entered in the correct way. These are the sort of questions that we asked during data cleaning. So did everyone enter the data how they were supposed to? And that's quite easy in a system like RedCap, where things are pre-filled and people have to enter specific answers to things. If you've sent people or used an Excel sheet, for example, then people, you might have entered ischemic heart disease in 4 or 5 different ways as a comorbidity, for example. So you need to first make sure that for each question, they've got specific answer responses, if it's a categorical variable, and that there's no crossover, that they're unique and reproducible, and they are defined in the same way that you use in your protocol. If you have any continuous data, it's important you keep an eye out for unrealistic values. That might be a operating time of 3 days, or a hemoglobin level of 0.1 grams per deciliter. And again, during your data collection, you might have put limits around that if that's possible within your data collection form. But you will never be surprised if you're working with lots of people in different teams. People will always make mistakes when entering data. So absolutely check each value, make sure that it makes sense within the normal limits of what you would expect. If you identify any problems, then I highly encourage you to go back to the data itself, or if you've worked with other people, send them a query and say, like, is this the actual value? Often people will make mistakes. Sometimes you'll find that it's actually just a true value that's surprised you, which is also interesting. The other thing to watch out for is if you've asked slightly similar questions in different ways, have people come back to you with responses which disagree with one another. That's quite difficult to deal with. So if you ask them about the type of hospital, and people answer that they receive referrals, but maybe it's like a small district's kind of secondary hospital or like a primary care service, then those two things might not. So receive referrals for like a big surgical operation, but it's actually, that those kind of providers wouldn't usually have that service. And then you have to think about how you can deal with that. So during data cleaning, you need to make sure each patient record is going to be reproducible and useful for your analysis. Right, step 3. The next thing you need to do is to work out exactly which patients are going to go into your final analysis. And I really encourage you to create a flow chart as one of the earliest steps of your analysis process. So you can start at the top with all of the patients that you've entered into the study, and there might be specific reasons why patients are ineligible. One, they might not actually meet your inclusion or exclusion criteria. 2, there might be a key data point that's missing or that might have some ambiguity. So in this example, we had, I put the slightly different flowchart out, but in this example, if hospitals didn't enter like a hospital name or a country that was recognizable, then we were unable to link those responses to other people from the same hospital. So we had to exclude about 8% of the responses because we couldn't identify which hospital they were from, for example. Now this level of transparency is absolutely essential to journals, because they will want to know anyone that you've excluded, why was that? And we know that if you exclude too many people, that can bring big biases into your study population. So who are you actually going to do the analysis on? Once you've defined who you're going to do the analysis on, then you need to think about what you do when they have information missing. And missing data can be a real problem. I won't be able to I could probably spend a whole day talking just about missing data. But the important question to ask is how much data is missing for each patient and overall? And do the patterns of missingness, do they look like they're, do they look like they're completely at random? And could they be related to any particular factor? So one important example might be that your emergency patients have more missing data, like outcome data, for example. So if you were comparing outcomes of emergency and elective surgery, and you had more missing data in the emergency group, that might suggest that actually those patients, intuitively we know that emergency patients are higher risk. It might be that once they're discharged back to the communities, they may actually get really sick and die at home, or there might be another reason why they're unreachable. So you have to look and see, is there any patterns within the data that could suggest there's non-random missing data? If there is, then you have to, that is a major caveat for your work. If it looks like everything's at random, so you just have random data points missing for each patient, and there's no specific pattern, so there's no differences in kind of male and female missing data, perhaps in the kind of area that people live in, urban and rural areas, then you can you are able to meet the assumptions to do different things with missing data. So there's simple ways of imputing data. You could do like the next most likely category. You can look at other patients from a similar group and enter data, and there's also more complex ways of dealing with it, such as something called multiple imputation, where you effectively create a statistical model and assign the most likely value based on their other known characteristics. I won't go into that too much today, but certainly one of the key reviewer comments when you send your work to journals is about how you deal with missing data. In general, if you've got less than 5% missing data, then you usually don't have to worry about more complex methods. So it's a good rule of thumb. Okay, so you've worked out who you're going to do your analysis on, and you've worked out what you can do with missing data. Say you're going to do some simple imputation or no imputation because you've only got 2% missing data. Now you can go on with doing some interpretation. Now that amount of time that this takes to get to this point can sometimes be like months with a really big data set, and for a smaller data set, it can still take a couple of days. So you see, we're not rushing into jumping to do big, crazy statistical models and things. Absolutely start off with just making sure we've got the right patients. We understand who's been excluded and why, and if there's any missing data, how we're going to deal with it. Okay, so I'd have to credit Ewan Harrison in Edinburgh. There's one of our colleagues that co-founded the Global Search Collaborative, and for teaching all about data visualization and for helping me to understand how important this is right at the beginning of a analysis. So what do I mean by that? I basically mean create some simple graphs of your data to understand for each data point what are the sort of proportions across your key comparison groups. For continuous data, do they data points look like they have a normal or non-normal distribution? If you've created categorical factors, is there any redundant factor levels? So things that almost no one has responded to in that category. And if so, can you collapse any factors in a way that would make sense clinically? So spend a while understanding the patterns of your data without making any direct comparisons. So what we did here with that preparedness index was to try and understand the global distribution of preparedness of surgical services. So we had a look at things by kind of their health service resourcing, and so we just created some basically curves looking at the proportions of hospitals with responses from different healthcare resourcing settings, and we did kind of a global map looking at country by country what the kind of overall scores that people are assigned to the hospital were. We also looked across the 23 data points and what the distributions were overall as like a mean score, and across again different healthcare resource settings to start to get an understanding of potential kind of patterns in the data. Right, so you've starting to get an understanding of what your data looks like and what variables you have and whether they're normal or non-normal. And the next step is to summarize your population. So this is always tends to be kind of table 1 in your paper. What are your demographics? And we tend to present this overall for the main comparator group based on your research question or research questions. So here it was kind of looking at the hospitals that were rated. So for example, we looked at the kind of funding structure for that hospital, and that could be like government funded, public, private, or some kind of mixed model. And we looked overall and by different healthcare resource settings, so high, middle, and low income. So that gave us a bit of an understanding of what sort of hospitals were included in the study. Yeah, definitely encourage you to do this as your table 1. It's what your reviewers will expect, understanding who went into the study or what hospitals went into the study. So once you've got an idea of the patients or hospitals, whichever your study is looking at, the next thing is to have a look at and summarize your outcomes. So without making comparison between groups, what was the overall kind of distribution of your outcomes? And here we were looking at surgical volume. So these are like slightly complex figures, but we basically looked at the proportion of elective surgery volume that the hospital was doing at the time we did the assessment versus the same month 2 years previously in the time before the pandemic. So if you scored 100%, and that would be that you were doing at the time of the assessment, the hospital was doing the same number of operations that it was doing before the pandemic. If you scored 150%, that meant that you'd managed to increase your surgical volume by a whole half. So, really high volume in a period of high pressure. If your score was kind of lower than that, so say 50%, that meant that you were doing 50% of the operations that you were doing pre-pandemic, so that your surgical throughput decreased by half. Each line here represents a different hospital, and you can see there were hospitals that were doing lots of more operating than usual in high, middle, and low income settings, and hospitals that were doing much less operating than usual in both high, middle, and low income settings in this study. So we've got an idea about our patients, we've got an idea about our outcomes. We've handled them completely separately for now, presenting them simply, not doing any statistical fandangly stuff. We're just presenting the outcomes as they are and letting the data speak for itself. So the next thing to do is to start to look for plausible associations between your key comparison groups and your outcomes. And by plausible, I mean that they're linked by some kind of causality. So let me just take you through what this is. And more journals are starting to ask for causal models when you do things like regression in papers. You're trying to find associations between factors and observational data. So here we were looking at how prepared a hospital is for periods of external pressure and whether or not they were able to continue doing surgery. And the problem is that relationship it's got lots of confounding from other factors. And so what we did was describe how some of those relationships might work. So some of the things that we thought clinically might affect your surgical volume would be things like how hard hit the service was by COVID. So if you had a really high COVID burden, lots of patients coming in through the door with COVID, that would probably have an impact on the surgical volume. Other things we looked at were the hospital's funding structure. So if you had private funding, perhaps there might be better resourcing than government funded hospitals. If you have more beds, perhaps that would affect your surgical volume. So each arrow here represents a relationship. So effectively you're saying that all of these factors can contribute to both the exposure, the main thing that you're comparing, and the outcome. But there is some kind of plausible relationship between these factors. What we haven't put in here is something about the schools that people went to, or it's something random which is obviously unrelated to two factors. You want to understand that if you're looking for associations in data, they have to be plausible and supported by our understanding of the world. There is a brilliant book about causal relationships that it's called The Book of Why. I'd be delighted to talk to anyone else about that. It's really worth the read. Okay, let's go back a little bit. Okay, so when we were looking for plausible associations in this data, first of all, we plotted the relationship between the surgical volume and the overall score of a hospital in terms of their preparedness. And so what we saw was that as a hospital was better prepared for external pressures, so pandemics, for example, as did the service, was able to provide more surgery. So a really intuitive finding, which basically underpinned the whole of this study. But what we wanted to see is, was that relationship kind of reproducible across different subtypes of hospital, or was it just, so was it a robust to different subgroups? So we looked at this across different healthcare resource settings. We looked across different types of hospitals, different patient populations, different sizes of hospital. And what we saw is, regardless of which group we looked at, there was still this relationship between how prepared the hospital was and how much surgery they were able to provide. So really important finding. So we talked a bit about causality. Confounding is when, of course, there is something else which is at play in linking an exposure and an outcome. So here we looked at this example of COVID-19 burden. So if a hospital was very prepared and had a very low COVID burden, probably their planned surgical volume would have been really excellent. If the hospital was very prepared but had a very high COVID burden, perhaps their surgical volume would have been lower, but that was confounded by this additional factor within this relationship. So you're understanding a bit about confounding and a bit about causality. So what do we do about confounding? Well, the statistical methods we can use to adjust for things that we know that can affect a relationship between an exposure and an outcome. And those are all based around regression analysis. So what we did here, and there's lots of different types of regression. If you have two continuous variables like we have here, you can use linear regression. If there's a relationship, more commonly people look at relationships between a binary outcome. So it might be, did the patient die, yes or no, or did they get a wound infection, yes or no? But the key thing is that you're going to create a statistical model which can adjust for things that you've measured that you think are going to confound the relationship between an exposure and an outcome. So here we looked at the preparedness index here, which effectively for every 10-point increase in this preparedness score, you would expect a 3.5% increase in the surgical volume of the hospital. It's a really meaningful difference. Okay, so there's a few quite complex things in there. So I think we should pause for some questions and things in a second. But I think overall, I've really encouraged you to get a team around you when you're doing an analysis to bounce things off people. And they may have some statistical knowledge and statistical experience. I know that in the clinical world, it's quite hard to find people with that expertise, but as much as you can, if you can find people that have been through this process before, that's really, really helpful. If you've got a team of people around you that understand the project, understand the data, and are able to give you feedback and you can sound ideas off people, that's just a really, really important step to getting your data interpretation right. Remember to start with your hypothesis, and a really key, really useful tip for doing that is to kind of write your abstract right at the start, with no, you don't even need to have any data. It will just focus you on the sort of thing which will make it into the key summary of your paper. Any analysis outside of your research questions are probably going to get lost from your abstract, which is great, because then you're just very focused on your key questions. The very last thing you should do is any type of statistical model. Really let the data speak for itself. What are the key summaries of your patients, your outcomes, and what are the basic summaries of the relationships between them? Finally, there's some brilliant resources for you in Ghana, and I think I saw Ben was in the chat earlier, but there's the Ghanaian hub of the NIHR Unit on Global Surgery is at the University of Developmental Studies in Tamale, led by the co-director of the unit, Professor Stephen Taberi. He's a fantastic leader and has great experience in leading global research. highly encourage you to get involved with the Ghanaian unit. And I put my email at the bottom here for any follow-up questions, or I'm just happy to support with anything related to research or career development, or anything I can do to help support you. So I'm going to stop there, and perhaps we can have some time for thoughts, questions, reflections from the audience. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, James. That was an excellent one. Really enjoyed it. I think we have some questions from some of our audience. So if you type a question, you can just ask it. You can unmute yourself and ask, or Dr. Dorcas Oseo can.
If you have a question, just raise your hand so that I can unmute.
Perhaps I can ask a question, because Teddy, you have lots of experience of research yourself. How do you approach your data interpretation? Is there anything that you do the same as what I've described, or anything that you do differently to what I've described in your experience of research today?
Yeah, so I think the main thing, I wouldn't say, first of all, I wouldn't say I have so much experience with research, very little. But I think the key thing I find is making sure that you get the question right, and then also making sure that the data is collected in a way that you can actually make sense of it. Because when I was doing house job, I actually decided to undertake this project with a couple of friends that was looking at bullying in the medical profession. It was quite difficult because we took the data at a point without taking a lot of things into consideration. And now when it got to analysis, it was very difficult to actually make sense of the data. We had to, at a point, go back and retake the whole data set again, because there were lots of very crucial missing points. And I think that was like, I learned it the hard way, because we spent all this time taking this data for weeks and then had to go back and redo the whole thing again, because very important things that were supposed to answer our question were missing from the data set.
That's a really great point. I remember doing the same thing myself many times in the past. One of the things that we do now to try and minimize that is do kind of a pilot in just for a few patients in a few different hospitals, and we do it personally as well. So even for a really big project, we'll do it ourselves in our hospital first with just a few patients, and try and pick out some of those the kinks in the system, and if there's any data points that are impossible to collect. And one of the interesting things is if you collect like a data point that's quite similar, so if you want to know hemoglobin and the mean cell volume, for example, and that's like not a particularly difficult extra question to ask, because you might be probably on the same piece of paper or in the same system when you look it up. But if you add a new data point, there's like a completely different system or process, say like estimated blood loss in theatre, then that could be like a total nightmare because people always make up People will never record it, and people, it's very difficult to guess in any case. So if you're able to kind of pilot your data collection, it means that any difficult data points you can get rid of. The idea of like writing your abstract really early, even before you have data, is a really, really good one that's got me out of a lot of sticky problems. If you write your abstract and you think, I'm collecting like the creatinine 15 times, but there's nothing about creatinine in my abstract, then you could probably say, I probably don't need it. And one of the other things you'll learn as young researchers is that when you go to colleagues, mentors and things, no one's ever going to say, that's absolutely right, you've hit the nail on the head first time. Like, just by asking someone, they feel like they have to add something or change something or contribute. And so people will, if you ask 10 people, you might end up with 40 new data points that are of interest to people. And so you're like, the art you have to develop is to pick out good advice, and also have the strength to sometimes kind of put some advice to one side. And it's all about collecting data on the things which you must have to answer your research question, not necessarily things that are nice to have. So must-haves, not nice-to-haves. It's a great way to design a study. But thanks very much for sharing your experience. I've definitely had that same problem.
That's good advice about the abstract. And actually, it's sometimes very difficult. But then I think as young researchers, it's key, or it's very relevant to be able to, not say no, but push aside some advice, like you said. It is a little bit difficult. Especially when you're young and you're starting out and your professor says, oh, you need to collect all these 15 other things. It's very difficult to say no, but then you must find a way to actually politely push away some things. Otherwise, I think at the end of the day, you've collected like 100 different data points and you're not going to use a 10th of it.
So the way the key is to have a team around you. So if you've got like a little steering team for a project, maybe it's like 2 or 3 people, bigger for a bigger project. If someone suggests like, oh, you should have these data points, you say, I'll take it back to the team. And then the team, like together, you can come up with a bit of a consensus, and then it just depersonalizes everything. You're not saying that you're wrong or that's a bad idea. You're saying, actually, we took it back to the team and we think actually it might not be feasible for X, Y, and Z, but we're going to keep it in place for the next project. This is kind of developmental. It just, as much as you can depersonalize things. And Neil taught me that trick. You say, I'll take it back to the team, and then you can come up with it. With another question from the audience. I think Hakeem.
Okay.
I think Teddy. I think Hakeem's got their hand up.
Okay. Please speak. Doc, I see if you can unmute. Doc, I see if you can unmute the person to ask the question.
I have.
Yeah.
Okay, that was a very nice presentation. I wanted to ask concerning missing data. Once you realize that some data pieces are missing, and after going through the data you have, you realize that it can cover another research topic. Can you change your research topic to fit the data you already have? And I don't know whether if it's a good idea to do that.
So when I meant missing data, I meant for like the data points that you were going to collect, you might not have the information from each patient. I think what you mean is like, it's that there could be extra data points entirely that you want to collect, and which could expand your research question or develop your research question. That's always a hard one, isn't it? I guess we'd always encourage in the modern world, we would like, I guess we always encourage people to pre-specify hypotheses and to pre-publish their protocol so that we're doing hypothesis-driven research. The problem is sometimes if we're adding in extra things later, is that we can chase false positives in our data set. So probably what I would do is if you find that you've missed out a whole data point that you think would be really useful, I'd probably encourage you to think about how you can develop the project into its next step. So if you've done a project in one hospital, and you've got data on 100 patients, you've done a brilliant job. But actually, there's 2 or 3 data points around, I don't know, anemia that you really wanted to pick up on. Rather than going back to get that information for those patients, I encourage you to think, how can I grow the project? So can I, with InciSioN Ghana, could we do a multi-center audit or multi-center research project, which actually engages 4 or 5 hospitals? And we know that these 10 data points we didn't need for our analysis, but actually these 5 data points would enhance it and enrich what we would get. So actually, perhaps rather than going back, which can be a bit tricky sometimes, and it can sometimes have to go back to ethics boards and things. I'd encourage you to say, what's the next step forward? Is it a pilot, randomized trial through the Ghana Research Hub? And so you can effectively use your original data as like a pilot basically, and use that to create something bigger, more likely to impact on patient care. So that tends to be the direction of travel. But we quite often add just like 1 or 2 data points that are just a little bit fringe to our projects, because we think about we're like, oh, maybe for our next study, and that might be kind of a central theme. And so we're just trying to understand what that might look like, and if people can track certain things. Use that as like a pilot then, and then we're able to develop into something else for the future. But really great question, thank you.
Thank you, James. I think we have Bright Poetry. Hand is up. Doc, as if you can unmute Bright.
Bright, you can talk. Yeah.
Hi, Bright.
Thank you, Mr. James. My question was on step 5.
Sure.
Most of the things look abstract, but I think probably because I'm still in preclinical year, so it's understandable. But with the step 5, you're talking about checking for redundancy in the categories. I wanted you to go over it again.
Oh, okay, I understand what you mean. So effectively,
you can share your screen, James.
Yeah, of course. I don't think it's I don't think I've got that much extra information on the slides. It might be easier to talk about it. So if you've got like a pre-specified data point, so say it's like a comorbidity data point, and you've got the things which are listed in, there's an index called the Charleston Comorbidity Index that people sometimes use for research, and you've got 14 or 15 different things. You might find that across 100 patients, there's only like 1 patient that's had a history of like stroke, and there's only a couple of patients that had a history of ischemic heart disease. So when you're coming to do your analysis, you might find that those kind of numbers per group are too small, and you might want to group them together into some kind of cardio-cerebrovascular disease type group. It becomes more important when you look at kind of doing statistical testing the data and things. You've got really small group sizes, it's not so useful. The other problem often arises if you have like a not pre-specified levels in a data point, and you let people kind of fill them in, or you filled them in, and you've just kind of typed out like a long list of comorbidities from the patient's notes. You might end up with like saying the same thing in 3 or 4 different ways. You might have like angina, ischemic heart disease, MI, and effectively you're just saying kind of a similar thing about those patients, but in a slightly different way. So you might want to group all of those together into one, cardiovascular disease tick data point. So really trying to make your data usable in a way that's still clinically intuitive, but you haven't got kind of really small groups or overlapping groups in your data set. Does that kind of make a bit more sense?
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's definitely, when I first started doing research, I created like an Excel sheet, and I was like, I'm going to think so hard about the column headings, and of course didn't think at all about what you would put in the data cells. So you just and then also you work with friends in your hospital and ask them to help collect data as well. And everyone thinks about things differently. And there's even things like if you want to do kind of statistical testing and you've written angina with like a capital A and a lowercase a, then any like statistical software will count as two different like categories in your response. So you just have to make sure that everything, if you want a patient categorized in one way, it's written in the same way with the same, punctuation around it and all that sort of thing. Same number of spaces, that sort of thing. Reducing redundancy between your data points. It takes an incredibly long time, and as much as you can do up front, as Teddy suggested, to get kind of the project as well set up as you can, people can only answer in certain ways. Yeah, it makes such a big difference down the line. Thanks for your question.
James, somebody's asking that what do you use for your data analysis, and what do you use for your data analysis, and what is useful as a beginner in research?
That's a really good question. I use a software called R, and Teddy and I actually went on a course called Healthy R, which is run by our colleagues in Edinburgh. It's actually available free and online. I believe it's going to be run through the Ghanaian Data Centre at some point in the near future. I would have to check the timings with Professor Tiberi. But that is like an open access software, but it's effectively requires like a learning statistical coding, really, which is a little bit complex. I have to say it's probably easier than you think once you get started, because you can kind of copy and paste different bits and reuse them again and again. And if you're really interested in research, then it is probably worth going through that process. Teddy, perhaps we can signpost everyone those resources after we talk, but it does take a bit of investment of life to get that right. There is other statistical programs available. If you there's even kind of free resources on. I'll probably have to find them and send them over to you, Teddy. But there is there's free like graphics resources online, that quite a few of like the big kind of print magazines and journals and stuff use for their data visualization, which is actually quite good if you're just trying to plot data in a way which is kind of quite simple and intuitive. So perhaps I could share a couple of links after the discussion today. Often people use tools like SPSF, which is a little bit more kind of plug and play, but it usually requires a subscription through university and things. It's not particularly easily accessible if you work in if you kind of work in a hospital and aren't affiliated with a university. Teddy, what do you use for your system today? Are you still using R or?
Yeah, so no, not R, SPSS and Stata. So R is excellent. The only thing I would say about it, if you stop using it, you forget everything, and you'd have to start all over again. I'm a living testimony. So I actually started going over R a couple of months ago, so I'm catching up again. I think if the resources I have, we can share with those who are interested. And if you have any other resources for R, James, you can share with me. I'll share with them.
Yeah, and so there's a really good, I've forgotten the name, but there's a really good one just for plotting nice graphs and things, and which Dimitri actually uses a lot for his papers.
Is it Shiny?
It's not Shiny. It's like a R service. I mean, that's too complex for me, actually. I always have to ask people for help with that. There's a no, I will find the name and come back to you. It's used by the economists too for their graphs and stuff, and it's literally just put in the data. You choose which sort of graph you want, and it will help you to create a really nice like graphical format. I'm sorry, I've forgotten what it's called, but I will make sure we share it with everyone on the call. That
would be great. Are there any other questions? Dorcas? Okay. In the absence of any other questions, James, I want to say thank you very, very much. Thank you for making the time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really nice to see you, Teddy, and thank you everyone for the interaction and questions. And I left my email on the last slide, but I'll pop it in the chat too. If it's helpful for anyone to get in touch, then please do. Let's talk.
Sure. And I think you're done with the PhD.
I am.
Congratulations.
And thank you. I really appreciate that.
Congratulations.
It's been very enjoyable, and I understand Professor Tabiri is going to be advertising some PhDs and things in the near future. So, anyone is interested in research and more, it's a great opportunity to learn more in an amazing unit. So, yeah, thanks very much again, Teddy.
Thank you. I'll be in touch.
Brilliant. Thanks, Teddy. Thanks, everyone. I'll speak again soon.
All right. Dorcas, do you have any announcements for anyone?
Okay. Thank you everyone for coming for this meeting, and thank you, James, for the wonderful presentation. We would have our next webinar next week, 28th, on preparing an abstract for submission at a conference for presentation. I hope all of you will be there for that. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you.